You're found dead in a Siberian forest, lying flat on your back under a pine tree. Your boots are unlaced, no socks on your feet, sleeves pushed up to your elbows. Your eyes and mouth are wide open, staring at nothing. The official story? You wandered out into the freezing night and died of hypothermia. But here's what doesn't make sense. You're an experienced hiker who loves cold weather. You were excited about a mountain climb just hours away. And most disturbing of all, an independent forensic examination would later conclude you didn't die where you were found, and you certainly didn't die of hypothermia. This is the story of Colin Madsen, a 25-year-old American student whose mysterious death in the mountains of Siberia has haunted his family for nearly a decade. What started as a simple hiking trip turned into an international controversy involving alleged cover-ups, contradictory forensic evidence, and a mother's relentless fight for justice. Colin Robert Lloyd Madsen wasn't your typical American abroad. Born and raised in Missouri, he had fallen in love with Russia and its culture during his studies. By 2016, he was fluent in Russian and studying at the Irkutsk branch of Moscow State Linguistic University. But Colin was more than just a student. He was an environmental activist who volunteered with local Greenpeace chapters and helped build hiking trails around the pristine shores of Lake Baikal. Those who knew Colin described him as someone with an incredible tolerance for cold weather. He was the kind of person who would venture out into the Siberian wilderness regularly, always prepared, always cautious. His friends often joked about how he could handle freezing temperatures that would send others running for shelter. In March 2016, Colin planned what should have been a routine hiking trip to the Sayan Mountains near Arshan, a small tourist village about 200 kilometers southwest of Irkutsk. He was traveling with 3 friends, 2 Russians and 1 American, all excited about climbing a peak locals called Love Peak. The group arrived in Arshan on March 26, 2016, staying at a local guest house. Everything seemed normal. They spent the evening planning their hike, checking their equipment, and discussing the route they would take the next morning. Colin was particularly excited about the climb, talking animatedly about the views they would see from the summit. But sometime before dawn on March 27th, everything changed. Colin's friends woke up to find him gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. His hiking gear was still there, his warm clothes untouched. According to witness statements, Colin had simply walked out of the cabin in the early morning hours, wearing only a thermal shirt, without telling anyone where he was going. The immediate assumption was that he had gone to use the outdoor toilet facilities, but when he didn't return, his friends began to worry. This wasn't like Colin. He was responsible, always letting people know his plans, especially when it came to outdoor activities where safety was paramount. Local authorities were contacted, and a search operation began almost immediately. Russian police, rescue teams, and volunteers combed the surrounding forest and mountains. Colin's mother, Dana Madsen Calcutt, who is a doctor, flew from Missouri to Russia as soon as she heard about her son's disappearance, joining the desperate search efforts. For 8 agonizing days, teams searched the rugged terrain around Arshan. The weather was challenging, with temperatures dropping below freezing at night. Search helicopters flew overhead, while ground teams with tracking dogs explored every possible path Colin might have taken. Dana Calcutt later described the search operation as frustrating and poorly coordinated. She claimed that local police seemed more interested in asking questions about Colin's character and activities than actually finding him. Some officers even made what she considered defamatory remarks about her son, suggesting he might have been involved in drug use or other questionable behavior. On April 4, 2016, the search came to a tragic end. Colin's body was discovered by a search party approximately 1 mile from the guest house where he had been staying. He was found lying on his back under a large pine tree, positioned in a way that immediately raised questions among those who saw the scene. The location where Colin was found was particularly puzzling. It was less than 2 miles from where he had been staying, in an area that had supposedly been searched multiple times during the week-long operation. How had dozens of searchers missed a body in such a relatively accessible location? Even more disturbing were the circumstances in which Colin was found. According to witness accounts and crime scene photographs, he was lying flat on his back on grass and wilted vegetation, not huddled or curled up as hypothermia victims typically are. His boots were unlaced, he wasn't wearing socks, and his sleeves were pushed up to his elbows. His eyes and mouth were open, and his left arm was extended with both hands clenched into fists. Russian investigators immediately opened a murder investigation, which is standard procedure in missing person cases. However, their preliminary findings seemed to contradict what many expected. They found no obvious signs of external trauma. Colin's clothing appeared intact, and he was still carrying his wallet with cash and his American passport, ruling out robbery as a motive. But as details of the investigation began to emerge, Colin's family and friends noticed troubling inconsistencies in the official narrative. First, there was the question of clothing. Initial reports suggested Colin had left the guest house wearing only a t-shirt, which would explain why he succumbed to hypothermia. However, crime scene photographs clearly showed him wearing a long-sleeved thermal shirt, exactly the kind of clothing someone familiar with cold weather would choose for even a brief outdoor excursion. If you're finding this case as fascinating and disturbing as I am, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started. The evidence we're about to explore will challenge everything you think you know about this case, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Second, there was Colin's footwear situation. He was found wearing unlaced boots with no socks. Anyone who knew Colin found this detail particularly unbelievable. He had recently injured his ankle and would never have attempted to walk any significant distance in unlaced boots, especially without socks. The terrain around Arshan is rough and unforgiving, making such footwear not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. Third, there was Colin's mental state the night before his disappearance. All witnesses confirmed that he had been excited and enthusiastic about the planned hike. He had been looking forward to climbing Love Peak for weeks and had spent the evening before carefully preparing his equipment. It made no sense that someone so enthusiastic about a morning hike would suddenly decide to wander off into the forest in the middle of the night. Russian toxicology reports added another layer of complexity to the case. While tests on Colin's hair, blood, and nails came back negative for controlled substances, his urine showed the presence of cannabis metabolites at a concentration of 16.6 nanograms per milliliter. However, this finding raised more questions than it answered. The presence of cannabis metabolites doesn't indicate recent use, as these compounds can remain detectable in urine for weeks after consumption. More importantly, none of Colin's friends tested positive for any substances when they were screened 3 days after his body was found. If the group had been using drugs together on the night of March 26th, as Russian authorities suggested, why would only Colin test positive? Colin's mother, Dana Calcutt, was skeptical of the drug allegations from the beginning. She knew her son well and believed that if he had used marijuana, it would have been hours before his disappearance, not immediately before. She also pointed out that Colin was not the type to use drugs and then wander off into a dangerous forest alone. The Russian investigation moved quickly to a conclusion. By July 30th, 2016, just 4 months after Colin's death, authorities officially closed the case, ruling that he had died of hypothermia while under the influence of drugs. No evidence of foul play was found, according to their final report. But Dana Calcutt wasn't satisfied with these findings. As a medical professional herself, she understood the signs and symptoms of hypothermia death, and nothing about her son's case fit the typical pattern. Hypothermia victims usually remove their clothing as their condition worsens, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. Colin's clothing was not only still on his body, but appeared to be properly arranged. Determined to find the truth, Dana and her husband, University of Missouri Professor Mick Calcutt, decided to commission their own independent forensic examination. They reached out to Independent Forensic Services, a Colorado-based company that had worked on several high-profile criminal cases in the United States. The American forensic team was given access to the Russian autopsy reports, toxicology results, and crime scene photographs. What they found challenged every aspect of the Russian investigation's conclusions. The Independent Forensic Services report, completed in June 2017, concluded that Colin Madsen did not die of hypothermia. Instead, the evidence suggested he had died from mechanical asphyxiation, possibly suffocation. The report identified several key findings that contradicted the hypothermia theory. First, the forensic pathologists noted that Colin showed none of the typical signs of hypothermia death. His body position was inconsistent with someone who had frozen to death, as hypothermia victims typically curl into a fetal position to conserve body heat. Colin was found lying flat on his back with his limbs extended. Second, the American examination identified multiple injuries on Colin's body that had not been adequately explained by the Russian investigation. These included blunt force injuries to his head and extremities, including 2 abrasions surrounded by bruising on his scalp that the report stated cannot be caused by a fall. The pathologists concluded these injuries were most likely caused by external force applied to Colin's head. The report also noted suspicious injuries to Colin's left ear, including sharp abrasions that couldn't be explained by post-mortem changes to the skin. There were signs of bruising behind his left ear and unusual discoloration of his lips and nostrils, which the forensic team identified as consistent with external mechanical asphyxiation. Perhaps most significantly, the American forensic examination challenged the timeline of Colin's death. Based on the state of decomposition and the absence of expected insect activity and predator damage, the pathologists estimated that Colin's body had been in the forest for somewhere between 2 hours and 1 day maximum, not the 8 days that had elapsed between his disappearance and the discovery of his body. This finding raised explosive questions about the official timeline. If Colin hadn't been dead for 8 days, where had he been? What had happened to him during those missing days? And why had his body appeared in a location that had supposedly been searched multiple times? The forensic report also noted other suspicious elements that suggested Colin's body might have been moved to the location where it was found. The absence of expected post-mortem changes, the positioning of the body, and the relatively good condition of his remains all pointed to the possibility that he had died elsewhere and been transported to the discovery site. Armed with this new evidence, Dana Calcutt began a campaign to have her son's case reopened. She contacted U.S. Embassy officials, wrote letters to government representatives, and launched a petition calling for American authorities to pressure Russia into conducting a new investigation. The family's efforts gained international attention when Radio Free Europe published a detailed investigation into Colin's case in July 2017. The article highlighted the contradictions between the Russian and American forensic findings and raised questions about whether Russian authorities had conducted a thorough investigation. But the family's fight for justice faced significant obstacles. U.S. Embassy officials told Dana that they could not officially acknowledge homicide as the cause of death unless Russian authorities changed their determination. This created a bureaucratic catch-22. The American government couldn't act without Russian cooperation, but Russian authorities showed no interest in reopening a case they considered closed. The case took on additional complexity when questions were raised about Colin's activism in Russia. During his time in Siberia, he had been involved with environmental groups and had participated in protests organized by local Greenpeace activists. Months before his death, he had received a warning letter from local authorities about his participation in these protests. Some observers wondered whether Colin's environmental activism had made him a target. Russia has a complicated relationship with environmental organizations, particularly those with international connections. Foreign activists and their local partners often face harassment, intimidation, and worse. However, there was no direct evidence linking Colin's activism to his death. His involvement with environmental groups appeared to be relatively minor, focused mainly on trail building and peaceful protests. It seemed unlikely that such activities would have led to murder, but the possibility couldn't be entirely dismissed. This is where the case gets even more intriguing, And if you're as invested in finding out the truth as Colin's family has been for nearly a decade, hit that like button, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see this entire investigation. In 2020, 4 years after Colin's death, lawyers representing Dana Calcutt filed a formal petition with Russian authorities to reopen the investigation. The petition included the findings from the American forensic examination and requested that Russian investigators reconsider their conclusions based on this new evidence. The petition also demanded the return of evidence that Russian authorities had withheld from the family, including CCTV footage from Arshan, additional autopsy photographs, and tissue samples that could be subjected to further testing. The family argued that this evidence was crucial to understanding what had really happened to Colin. Russian authorities have not responded positively to these requests. The case remains officially closed, with the cause of death listed as hypothermia. No additional investigation has been conducted, and no new evidence has been made available to the family or independent researchers. The lack of cooperation from Russian authorities has fueled speculation about a potential cover-up. Some observers have suggested that local officials may have been involved in Colin's death, or may be protecting those who were responsible. Others believe that the initial investigation was simply incompetent and that officials are now reluctant to admit their mistakes. Dana Calcutt has not given up her fight for justice. She continues to advocate for her son's case, working with lawyers and activists to keep pressure on both Russian and American authorities. She has spent her family's savings on legal fees, forensic examinations, and travel costs related to the investigation. The emotional toll on the family has been enormous. Dana has described the past decade as a nightmare of bureaucratic obstacles, false promises, and crushing disappointment. She has watched other families receive justice for loved ones who died abroad while her son's case remains in limbo. The Colin Madsen case highlights the challenges faced by families seeking justice when their loved ones die under suspicious circumstances in foreign countries. International law enforcement cooperation can be complicated by political tensions, jurisdictional issues, and differing legal systems. In Colin's case, these challenges have been compounded by the deteriorating relationship between the United States and Russia. Since 2016, relations between the two countries have reached their lowest point since the Cold War, making cooperation on criminal cases increasingly difficult. The case also raises questions about the safety of American students and activists abroad. Colin's death occurred during a period of increasing restrictions on foreign NGOs and civil society organizations in Russia. While there's no evidence that his activism directly led to his death, the case serves as a reminder of the potential risks faced by Americans engaged in political or environmental activities overseas. Recent developments in the case have been limited. The COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing tensions between the US and Russia have made it even more difficult for the family to pursue their investigation. However, Dana Calcutt continues to hope that new evidence will emerge, or that political changes will create opportunities for progress. One potential avenue for advancement is the growing international attention to cases of suspicious deaths and human rights violations in Russia. As more cases come to light and international pressure increases, there may be opportunities to revisit cold cases like Colin's. The advancement of forensic technology also offers hope. New testing methods and analytical techniques might be able to extract additional information from existing evidence, potentially providing new insights into what happened to Colin during his final hours. For now, Colin Madsen's case remains a tragic mystery that has consumed his family's lives for nearly a decade. The young man who loved Russia and its people enough to learn the language, study the culture, and dedicate himself to environmental conservation died under circumstances that may never be fully explained. The case serves as a reminder that justice is not always achievable, even when families have resources, determination, and compelling evidence. Sometimes the pursuit of truth runs up against walls of bureaucracy, politics, and indifference that seem impossible to overcome. But Dana Calcutt's fight continues, driven by a mother's love and an unshakable belief that her son deserves justice. As she has said repeatedly, she's not fighting against Russia or its people, but for the truth about what happened to Colin in those final hours in the Siberian forest. The Colin Madsen case reminds us that behind every unsolved mystery, there are real people suffering real pain. For Colin's family, the question isn't just what happened to their son, but whether justice is possible when the truth is inconvenient for those in power. If this case has moved you the way it has moved me, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Cases like Colin's need to be told, remembered, and investigated until the truth finally comes to light. Because somewhere out there, someone knows what really happened to Colin Madsen in the early hours of March 27, 2016. And until that truth comes forward, his family will continue to fight, and his story will continue to demand answers that may never come.